Jim Halpert is not a good person. And as someone who has seen The Office 4 times now, I think I can say this with some confidence: Jim Halpert is not a good person. When you watch the show for the first time, you're naturally led to believe that he is. In an office full of chaos, awkwardness, and constant embarrassment, Jim is framed as the normal one. He's not humiliating himself like Michael, he's not as extreme as Dwight, and he always seems just detached enough to feel above everything. So naturally, people label him the good guy. He's funny, charming, attractive, and always knows the right thing to say. The camera loves him, the audiences love him, and he becomes the easiest character to identify with. But the more you rewatch the show, the more you realize something uncomfortable. Jim's entire personality is heavily built around feeling superior to everyone around him. He humiliates Dwight for entertainment, avoids confrontation until it becomes unavoidable, emotionally checks out when things get difficult, and hides behind sarcasm so he never really has to be fully sincere or accountable. Even his famous camera glances feel less like sheer confusion and more like subtle invitations for the audience to laugh at everyone else with him. And that's precisely what makes Jim so interesting to me, because The Office tricks you into confusing charm with goodness. In recent years, especially after the show blew up again through streaming and rewatches, people have started re-evaluating Jim Halpert. A lot of newer viewers notice something older audiences overlooked. Jim can come across as condescending even when he's being funny. And I really think that's exactly what makes him such a strange post-watch character, someone who shifts dramatically depending on how much life experiences you bring into the show. When I watched The Office for the first time, I genuinely thought it was one of the best sitcoms ever made. I loved that awkward humor, the characters, the documentary style, everything about it worked for me. But over time, after watching more television, I realized something. The Office is not perfect, and a lot of that becomes visible through how it treats Jim. Because despite the questionable things Jim does, the show constantly frames him as the lovable, reasonable guy in a room full of chaos. The framing is powerful and it shapes how audiences interpret his behavior. Jim is witty, socially aware, and emotionally intelligent, but the question is, does being smarter than everyone else automatically make you better than them? Because that's the illusion the show creates. The series often treats self awareness as morality. Since Jim understands how ridiculous everyone else is, the audience starts excusing how he treats them. The sarcasm becomes harmless, his detachment becomes relatable, and his pranks become justified. But when you strip away that framing, a lot of his behavior starts to look less like harmless comedy and more like passive aggression disguised as humor. And that's why I think Jim becomes more interesting on rewatches. Once the charm wears off, you start noticing how often his humor depends on someone else being the butt of the joke. Most of that humor works because the targets are Michael or Dwight, characters already positioned as absurd. So when Jim mocks them, it feels acceptable or even deserved. But that illusion starts breaking the moment that dynamic changes. A perfect example is when Charles Miner enters the picture in season 5. Charles, played by Idris Elba, is one of the first characters who doesn't play along with Jim's persona. He doesn't find him charming or clever. He judges him purely on professionalism and competence. And suddenly, Jim loses control of his environment. His sarcasm stops working, his confidence dips, his usual cool guy presence doesn't land the same way. For the first time, he's not the most socially aware person in the room, and he doesn't know how to operate without that position. That's why the Charles Minor arc is so important. It removes the protective layer the show usually gives Jim. Because up until that point, Jim's identity depends heavily on the people around him. With Michael, he's the sane one. With Dwight, he's the clever one. With his co-workers, he's the observer above it all. But when someone arrives who doesn't reward that behavior, the cracks become visible. And that leads to something bigger. Jim's identity is deeply dependent on context. Take Dwight for example. Dwight is intense, socially aware, and often ridiculous, which makes him the perfect target for Jim's prank. The audience is already conditioned to laugh at Dwight, so Jim's behavior feels justified. But if you remove the comedic framing, a lot of what Jim does is actually quite harsh. He manipulates Dwight, wastes his time, embarrasses him publicly, and treats him more like a toy than a coworker. Dwight is strange, yes, but he's also sincere. He's honest about who he is. Jim, in contrast, hides behind irony and never fully exposes his emotional state. Then there's the documentary camera. The mockumentary style of The Office plays a huge role in how we perceive Jim. Every glance he gives the camera becomes a shared joke with the audience. It creates the illusion that we are in on it with him. That framing is so powerful because it positions Jim as the narrator without him ever actually speaking. So when something ridiculous actually happens and Jim looks at the camera, the audience automatically aligns with his perspective. It validates his sarcasm and reinforces the idea that he is the most rational person in the room. But again, that only works as long as the environment supports it. Once the environment changes, so does Jim. And that's what makes the Charles Minor storyline so revealing. Charles doesn't care about Jim's charm, he expects professionalism, and under that pressure, Jim struggles. His jokes don't land, his attitude feels out of place, and suddenly he doesn't feel like the cool observer anymore. That moment exposes something important. Jim's confidence is largely situational. It depends on being surrounded by people who validate his sense of superiority. When the validation disappears, so does his persona. Which brings us to Karen Filippelli. Karen is one of the earliest examples of how the show protects Jim from consequences. She's intelligent, emotionally stable, and genuinely invested in Jim, but narratively, she's never treated as fully central. Instead, she functions as a barrier between Jim and Pam. And because the audience is already invested in Jim and Pam, Karen's emotional experience becomes secondary. Jim enters a relationship with Karen while still being emotionally attached to Pam. He transfers branches with her, builds a future with her, and yet he never fully lets go of his feelings for Pam. And instead of the show challenging that behavior, it quietly frames Karen as the temporary phase in Jim's journey. Now, that's part of the broader pattern. The narrative consistently shields Jim from moral consequences, and that's what makes his character so fascinating and so decisive on rewatches. Because once you stop seeing him as the default good guy, you start seeing him as someone who relies heavily on other people being framed as worse in order to maintain that image. Jim Halpert works because the show carefully constructs a world around him where he always appears slightly above everyone else. But remove that framing and you start to see a different version of him. Someone who is witty, yes, but also emotionally avoidant, occasionally cruel, and deeply dependent on feeling superior to the people around him. And maybe that's why his character has become so interesting over time. Because the older you get, the less he feels like the sane man in an insane office, and the more he feels like someone who needed that office to be insane in order to feel okay about himself. Anyways, that's it from my side. If you watched The Office, let me know what you think of Jim Halpert down in the comments below. Has your opinion changed over the years, or do you still see him as the same way? And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, share and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you think. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.